At 8:47 a.m. on February 10, 1945, over the Pacific Ocean near Bataan, Philippines, Lieutenant Louis E. Kurds faced an impossible decision. Flying his P-51 Mustang named Bad Angel at 12,000 feet, he watched through his canopy as a Douglas C-47 transport aircraft lumbered through the sky below him, heading directly toward a Japanese-controlled airfield. The transport was American. The markings were clear: the white star on the fuselage, the tail number. Everything identified it as a United States Army Air Force's aircraft. And Louis Kurds was about to shoot it down, not because he was a traitor, not because he had lost his mind, but because that C-47, filled with American personnel, was minutes away from landing on enemy territory, where 13 people would be captured, tortured, and almost certainly executed. The pilot was lost, the navigation was wrong, and unless someone stopped that aircraft from landing, everyone aboard would die. Kurds tried the radio, again and again. C-47, you are off course. You are heading toward enemy territory. Turn back immediately. Repeat, turn back. Static. No response. The transport continued on its fatal heading, steady, oblivious, flying toward a death sentence. Kurds looked at his fuel gauge. He had maybe 20 minutes before he needed to turn back toward base. 20 minutes to make a decision that would either save 13 lives or end his career. 20 minutes to do something that no fighter pilot in the history of the United States military had ever done intentionally. He armed his guns. 6 50-caliber machine guns, 3,000 rounds of ammunition, designed to destroy Japanese fighters and bombers. And now, he was going to use them on an American aircraft, to save it. This is the story of Louis E. Kurds, the fighter ace who shot down enemy aircraft on 2 different fronts, who escaped from behind enemy lines, who became one of the most decorated pilots of World War II, and who, on a February morning in 1945, did something so extraordinary, so unprecedented, that it defies belief. He shot down a friendly aircraft to save it, and discovered hours later that one of the 13 people he saved was a woman he had met the night before, a woman who would become his wife. But to understand why this moment was so extraordinary, you need to understand the man who made it happen, because Louis Kurds was not an ordinary pilot. His path to that morning over Bataan was filled with near-death experiences, impossible escapes, and a level of combat skill that made him a legend among his peers. Louis Edward Kurds was born on November 2, 1919, in Fort Wayne, Indiana. He grew up during the Great Depression. His family was working class. His father was a machinist. Money was tight. But young Louis had a fascination with aircraft. He would ride his bicycle to the local airfield and watch planes take off and land for hours. He dreamed of flying, of being a pilot, of touching the sky. In 1939, when he turned 20, Kurds enlisted in the United States Army Air Corps. He wanted to be a pilot, but the requirements were strict. College education preferred. Perfect health mandatory. Superior reflexes required. Kurds had everything except the college degree, but his test scores were exceptional. His physical fitness was outstanding, and his determination was absolute. The Air Corps accepted him for flight training. He completed basic flight training in 1941, advanced training in 1942. By then, America was at war. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. The Pacific was on fire. Europe was under Nazi control, and the United States needed pilots, desperately. Kurds was assigned to the 82nd Fighter Group and sent to North Africa in 1943 to fly P-38 Lightnings against German and Italian forces. His first combat mission was over Tunisia. He was 23 years old, nervous, excited, terrified. He flew as wingman to a veteran pilot who had 6 kills. The mission was bomber escort, protecting B-17s attacking German supply lines. Simple, routine, until German fighters attacked. Messerschmitt Bf-109s dove from above, 8 of them, attacking the bomber formation. Kurds followed his element leader, stayed in position, did everything by the book, and watched his leader shoot down a German fighter, then another. And Kurds thought, I can do that. He broke formation, spotted a Bf-109 lining up on a B-17, dove after it, got on its tail, fired. The Messerschmitt exploded. Kurds' first kill. He was elated. He had done it. He was an ace in training. He returned to base feeling invincible. His commanding officer met him on the ground. You broke formation. You endangered yourself and others. If you ever do that again, I'll ground you permanently. Understand? Kurds understood, but he also understood something else. He was good at this, really good. And the rules, while important, sometimes needed to be bent to get the job done. Over the next 3 months, Kurds flew 47 missions over North Africa and Italy. He shot down 6 more German aircraft. He became known for aggressive flying, for taking risks, for bending rules when necessary to protect bombers or attack targets. His superiors didn't always approve, but they couldn't argue with results. 7 confirmed kills, 0 losses among the bombers he escorted. Then, on August 27, 1943, everything changed. Curtis was flying a mission over Sicily when his P-38 was hit by anti-aircraft fire. The left engine exploded. The right engine was damaged. He was losing altitude, losing control, and he was over enemy territory. He could have bailed out, parachuted into the Mediterranean and hoped for rescue, but his aircraft was still partially controllable, and there was a small airfield visible below. Enemy airfield. Italian, but an airfield nonetheless. Curtis made a decision. He was going to land there, on enemy territory, and either escape or become a prisoner of war. He brought the crippled P-38 down. Rough landing. The aircraft skidded off the runway, tore apart, but Curtis walked away, injured but alive. He crawled out of the wreckage and ran toward the tree line. Behind him, Italian soldiers were running toward the crashed aircraft. Curtis reached the trees, kept running, and disappeared into the Sicilian countryside. For the next 11 days, Louis Kurds evaded capture. He moved at night, hid during the day, ate whatever he could find, avoided roads and towns. He was deep in enemy territory. No radio, no map, no weapons except a small survival knife. And he was determined to get back to Allied lines. Italian civilians helped him. At great risk to themselves, they gave him food, shelter, directions. They hated Mussolini's fascist regime. They wanted the Allies to win. And they were willing to help this young American pilot who had crash-landed in their country. On September 7, 1943, 11 days after being shot down, Kurds reached American lines in southern Sicily, exhausted, malnourished, but alive. He reported to his unit, was debriefed by intelligence, and was given 2 weeks of rest and recuperation before returning to combat. But Kurds didn't rest. He volunteered to return to flying immediately. His commanding officer refused. You need rest. You've been through trauma. Take the time. Kurds insisted. I'm fine. I want to fly. The argument went back and forth. Finally, a compromise. 1 week of rest, then back to flying. Kurds flew 23 more missions over Italy and southern Europe. He shot down 3 more aircraft, bringing his total to 10 confirmed kills. He was now an ace, a decorated fighter pilot, and someone the Air Force wanted to keep alive. So in early 1944, they pulled him from combat and assigned him to training duty in the United States. Kurds was frustrated. He wanted to keep fighting, but orders were orders. He spent 6 months training new fighter pilots in Florida. teaching them combat tactics, gunnery, evasion, everything he had learned in North Africa and Italy. His students loved him. He was experienced, patient, and he shared real combat stories that made the training feel relevant. But Kurds was restless. He wanted back in the war. And in late 1944, he got his wish. The Air Force needed experienced pilots in the Pacific. The war against Japan was intensifying. The Philippines were being liberated, and fighter pilots with combat experience were in high demand. Kurds volunteered immediately. He was assigned to the 3rd Air Commando Group, flying P-51 Mustangs in the Philippines. The P-51 was different from the P-38 he had flown in Europe. Faster, more maneuverable, better range, and Kurds loved it. He named his aircraft Bad Angel and painted his kill markings on the fuselage. 10 enemy aircraft destroyed. He was ready to add more. His first missions in the Pacific were ground attack, strafing Japanese positions, destroying supply convoys, supporting American ground troops. It was different from air-to-air combat in Europe, more dangerous in some ways. The Japanese had intense anti-aircraft fire, and they didn't surrender. They fought to the death. In January 1945, Curtis shot down a Japanese fighter near Manila, his 11th kill. Then another near Bataan, 12 kills total. He was becoming one of the top-scoring pilots in the Pacific theater, but his reputation wasn't just about kills. It was about his ability to think unconventionally, to solve problems in ways that others wouldn't consider. Which brings us back to February 10, 1945. That morning, Curtis took off from Mangaldan Airfield on a routine patrol mission. His job was to search for Japanese aircraft, protect American positions, and report any unusual activity. Standard mission. He had flown dozens like it. He expected nothing unusual. At 0847, he spotted the C-47, a Douglas transport aircraft, twin-engine, lumbering through the sky at about 8,000 feet, heading northeast toward Bataan. Kurds recognized immediately that something was wrong. There were no scheduled C-47 flights in that direction, and the heading the aircraft was following would take it directly to a Japanese-controlled airfield near the former Bataan Peninsula. Kurds flew closer, checked the markings. Definitely American. U.S. Army Air Forces, no question. He tried the radio. C-47, this is P-51 Bad Angel. You are off course. You are heading toward enemy territory. Acknowledge. Nothing. No response. The C-47 continued on its heading. Steady, unwavering. Kurds tried again. Different frequencies, emergency channels. Nothing worked. Either the C-47's radio was malfunctioning, or they weren't monitoring the correct frequency, or they were too focused on navigation to notice his calls. Kurds flew alongside the C-47, close enough to see into the cockpit. He could see the pilot, co-pilot. They were looking at maps, instruments. They seemed completely unaware that they were flying toward enemy territory. Kurds waved his wings, the international signal for "Follow me." The C-47 didn't respond. He checked his map. The C-47 was 15 minutes from the Japanese airfield, 15 minutes from landing in enemy territory, where everyone aboard would be captured. And Kurds knew what happened to American prisoners in Japanese hands. Torture, execution, beheading, bayonet practice. The Japanese did not follow Geneva Convention rules for prisoners of war. Kurds made his decision. He was going to stop that C-47 from landing, by force, if necessary. He dropped back, positioned himself behind and below the transport. He armed his guns, 6 .50 caliber Browning machine guns, loaded with armor-piercing and incendiary rounds, capable of shredding an aircraft in seconds, and he was about to fire them at an American aircraft. He thought about the consequences: court-martial, possible execution for attacking friendly forces, his career destroyed, his reputation ruined, everything he had worked for gone. But those thoughts lasted maybe 3 seconds, because the alternative was 13 Americans captured and killed by the Japanese, and that was unacceptable. Kurds aimed carefully, not at the fuselage, not at the cockpit, not at the wings where fuel tanks would explode. He aimed at the right engine, one engine, disable it, force them to turn around or make an emergency landing, but not kill anyone. He fired. A 2-second burst, 50 rounds, tracers arcing through the sky, impacting the right engine of the C-47. The engine coughed, sputtered, began trailing smoke. The C-47 lurched. The pilot finally realized something was catastrophically wrong. But the C-47 didn't turn around. It kept flying toward the Japanese airfield, now with one engine failing, losing altitude, but still heading toward enemy territory. The pilot was probably trying to reach what he thought was a safe airfield. He didn't realize it was controlled by the Japanese. Kurds had no choice. He positioned for another pass, this time targeting the left engine. If he destroyed both engines, the C-47 would have to ditch in the ocean. Risky. People might die in the water landing, but better than certain death in Japanese captivity. He fired again. Another burst. The left engine erupted in flames. Now the C-47 was in serious trouble. Both engines damaged or destroyed, losing altitude rapidly. The pilot radioed for the first time. "Mayday! Mayday! We're hit! Engines failing! We're going down!" Kurds responded immediately. "C-47, you were heading toward Japanese territory. I stopped you. Ditch in the ocean. I repeat, ditch in the ocean. I will guide rescue." There was a pause. Then the pilot's voice, confused and angry. "You shot us down? You're American." "Affirmative. You were about to land at a Japanese airfield. Everyone would have been captured. Ditch now. There's an island 2 miles south, shallow water. I'll guide you." The C-47 pilot had no choice. The aircraft was going down regardless. Better to follow the fighter pilot's instructions than to crash randomly. He turned south, aimed for the water near a small island, and prepared for an emergency water landing. Kurds circled above, watching, directing. "Gear up, flaps down, shallow angle. You're doing fine. Steady, steady. Now!" The C-47 hit the water, hard. The impact tore off the tail section. Water rushed into the fuselage, but the aircraft floated. The pilot had done it perfectly. Emergency landing successful. Kurds saw people emerging from the aircraft, climbing onto the wings, into life rafts. He counted 13 people, all moving, all alive. He had done it. He had saved them all. He radioed base. "This is bad, Angel. I have a C-47 down in the water. 13 survivors. Coordinates follows. Request immediate rescue." Then he circled above the survivors, protecting them, watching for Japanese patrol boats, staying until rescue arrived. 37 minutes later, an American patrol boat reached the survivors. They pulled everyone from the water, all 13, cold, shocked, angry, but alive. The rescue boat radioed Kurds. "All survivors recovered. You can return to base." Kurds flew back to Mangaldan. He landed, shut down his engine, and sat in the cockpit for a moment, thinking about what he had just done. He had shot down an American aircraft, intentionally. He could be court-martialed, executed, dishonored. Everything depended on whether his superiors understood why he did it. He climbed out of the cockpit. His crew chief was waiting. "How was the mission, Lieutenant?" Kurds looked at his aircraft, at the gun barrels, still warm from firing. "I shot down a C-47, an American C-47. The crew chief thought he was joking. "Good one, sir. I'm serious. It was heading toward a Japanese airfield. I couldn't stop it any other way. Everyone survived, but I need to report to the commanding officer immediately." The crew chief's face went pale. "Sir, You're going to need a good lawyer." Kurds walked to the operations building. He found his commanding officer, stood at attention. "Sir, I need to report an incident. I engaged and disabled a friendly C-47 transport aircraft at 0847 this morning. The aircraft was heading toward Japanese-controlled territory. Radio contact was impossible. I determined that disabling the aircraft was the only way to prevent it from landing in enemy hands. All 13 personnel aboard survived and have been rescued." The commanding officer stared at him, speechless. Finally, "You did what?" Kurds repeated his report. The commanding officer sat down. "Do you realize what you've done? You attacked an American aircraft. I don't even know what that is. Mutiny? Treason? Saving lives, sir. That C-47 would have landed at a Japanese airfield. Everyone aboard would have been captured and executed. I chose to disable the aircraft and force a water landing. Everyone survived." The commanding officer thought for a long moment. "Wait here. Don't talk to anyone. Don't go anywhere. I need to make some calls." Kurds waited. For 3 hours. Officers came and went, looked at him, whispered. He knew his career was probably over, but he didn't regret the decision. 13 people were alive because of what he did. That was all that mattered. Finally, the commanding officer returned. With him was a colonel from intelligence. The colonel spoke first. "Lieutenant Kurds, we've reviewed your report and interviewed the survivors of the C-47. Their aircraft suffered multiple navigation failures. They were lost. They were indeed heading toward a Japanese-controlled airfield. Your intervention saved their lives. However, your methods were unprecedented." Kurds waited for the hammer to fall. The colonel continued. "The pilot of the C-47 has confirmed that you tried to signal them, that you attempted radio contact, that you did everything possible to warn them before resorting to weapons, and that your shooting was precise. You disabled the engines without killing anyone. That shows exceptional skill and judgment." Still waiting. "Lieutenant Kurds, instead of a court-martial, you're being recommended for a decoration. Your actions saved 13 American lives. That's what matters. Congratulations. You're dismissed." Kurds couldn't believe it. "I'm not being punished?" "Punished? You're a hero. Now get out of here before I change my mind." Kurds left the office in a daze. He had gotten away with it. He had shot down an American aircraft and was being decorated instead of court-martialed. It was the most extraordinary outcome imaginable. But the story doesn't end there, because later that day, Curtis was invited to the hospital, where the survivors of the C-47 were being treated for minor injuries and shock. The pilot wanted to thank him personally. Curtis agreed to go. He arrived at the hospital, found the ward where the survivors were gathered. The pilot, a captain, stood up and shook his hand. "You saved our lives. We were completely lost. We thought we were heading to a safe airfield. We had no idea it was Japanese-controlled. If you hadn't stopped us—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Curtis nodded. "I'm glad everyone's okay." Then one of the nurses stepped forward. A young woman in her 20s, dark hair, beautiful eyes. She looked familiar. She smiled. "We've met before." Kurds looked at her more carefully and suddenly remembered. The previous evening, the officers' club at base. He had been having a drink after a mission. A group of nurses had come in, Army nurses, just arrived from Guam. He had talked to one of them, this one. They had laughed, talked about home, about the war, about how surreal it all was. She had told him her name, Valerie. No, Velma. Velma Mayers. "You were on that C-47?" Kurds asked. "I was. All 12 of us nurses were being transferred to a hospital in Manila. The pilots got lost, and then this crazy fighter pilot started shooting at us." She smiled. "Thank you for being crazy." Kurds didn't know what to say. I'm just glad you're safe." They talked for an hour. About the mission, about her work as a nurse, about his missions, about home. And by the end of that hour, something had changed between them. A connection had formed. Not romantic, not yet, but something deeper. He had saved her life. She owed him everything. And he found himself caring about her in a way he hadn't expected. Over the next 3 weeks, Kurds visited the hospital regularly. He told himself he was checking on all the survivors, making sure they were okay. But really, he was there to see Velma. They talked, walked, shared stories, fell in love. It happened fast, too fast maybe, but this was war. Time moved differently. Tomorrow wasn't guaranteed. You took happiness where you could find it. On March 4th, 1945, Louis Kurds and Velma Mayers got engaged. They didn't tell many people. They knew it was quick, that people would question it, but they didn't care. They had found something real in the middle of a war, and they weren't going to let it go. Kurds returned to flying missions, but now he had something to fight for beyond duty. He had someone waiting for him, someone who depended on him coming home, and that changed everything. He flew 34 more combat missions over the Philippines and later over Okinawa. He shot down 2 more Japanese aircraft, bringing his final total to 14 confirmed kills, making him an ace multiple times over. But the kill that mattered most to him wasn't an enemy aircraft. It was that C-47, the friendly aircraft he had shot down to save it. On his P-51 Bad Angel, Kurds painted his kill markings: swastikas for German aircraft, rising suns for Japanese aircraft, and one small American flag for the C-47. It was unprecedented. Pilots didn't mark friendly aircraft on their planes, but Kurds did, because that was the most important thing he had ever done. Not shooting down enemies, but saving friends. The war ended in August 1945. Japan surrendered. Louis Kurds returned to the United States a hero, decorated, celebrated, and engaged to the woman whose life he had saved without knowing it. Louis and Velma were married on October 27, 1945 in San Francisco. The ceremony was attended by several of the survivors from the C-47. The pilot who had been flying that day gave a speech. Most grooms give their brides flowers or jewelry. Louis gave Velma her life. He shot us out of the sky to save us. I'm not sure there's ever been a more dramatic way to meet your future wife. The story of Louis Kurds and the C-47 became legendary. It was written about in newspapers, featured in military magazines, told and retold in officers' clubs around the world. The pilot who shot down his own side and became a hero. The man who broke every rule to save lives. The fighter ace who fell in love with one of the people he rescued. After the war, Kurds remained in the Air Force. He flew in the Korean War, became a test pilot, rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel. He retired in 1963 after 24 years of service. He and Velma had 3 children, built a life together, grew old together. Louis Kurds died on February 5, 1995, at the age of 75. Velma was at his side. She held his hand, told him she loved him, reminded him of the day they met, the day he shot her out of the sky. They both laughed. Even at the end, the story still seemed impossible. At his funeral, his P-51 Bad Angel was represented in photographs and paintings, including close-ups of his kill markings: 10 swastikas, 4 rising suns, and 1 American flag. That flag, more than anything else, defined Louis Kurds. A man who understood that sometimes saving lives means breaking rules, that honor isn't about following orders blindly. It's about doing what's right, even when what's right seems crazy. The story of Louis Kurds is not just about a pilot who shot down an American aircraft. It's about a man who saw a problem, calculated the risks, and made a decision that others wouldn't have dared to make. It's about the fact that sometimes the most heroic act is the one that looks like treason, that saving lives can mean destroying property, that real courage means being willing to be court-martialed to do what's right. 13 people lived because Louis Kurds was willing to risk everything. 13 families remained intact. 13 futures were preserved. And one of those 13 became his wife, the woman he saved, the woman he loved, the woman who spent 50 years telling people, "My husband shot me down, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me." Today, the story of Louis Kurds is taught at Air Force academies as a case study in decision-making under pressure. Students debate whether he made the right choice, whether the risk was justified, whether shooting down a friendly aircraft could ever be heroic. But the answer is clear. 13 people survived. That's all that matters. Kurds understood something fundamental. Rules exist to protect people, but when following rules means people die, you break the rules. The P-51 Mustang Bad Angel no longer exists. It was scrapped after the war. But photographs remain, and in those photographs you can see the kill markings, including that one small American flag, a symbol of the most unconventional victory in aviation history. The enemy aircraft he destroyed to save it. The mission he completed by shooting down his own side. Louis Edward Kurds was a fighter ace, a decorated pilot, a hero. But more than that, he was a man who understood that heroism isn't about glory. It's about making impossible choices and living with the consequences. It's about being willing to sacrifice your career to save lives. It's about shooting your friends to protect them. On February 10, 1945, at 08:47 a.m., Louis Kurds shot down an American C-47 transport aircraft. He saved 13 lives. He met his future wife, and he proved that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is something that looks absolutely insane. Because in war, sanity and heroism don't always align. Sometimes you have to be a little crazy to be truly brave, and Louis Kurds was both. Crazy enough to shoot down a friendly aircraft, brave enough to face the consequences, and lucky enough that everyone survived, including the woman who would spend the next 50 years reminding him, "You shot me down, and I fell in love with you anyway." That's the story of Louis Kurds, fighter ace, rule breaker, hero, husband, the man who destroyed an aircraft to save it, the pilot who shot down the wrong plane for all the right reasons, and the only man in history to mark a friendly kill on his aircraft and be celebrated for it. His final score, 14 enemy aircraft destroyed, 1 friendly aircraft saved, 13 lives preserved, 1 love story created, and a legacy that proves courage sometimes means doing the unthinkable. Because Louis Kurds didn't shoot down that C-47 to hurt anyone, he shot it down because he refused to let 13 people die when he had the power to save them. That's heroism. Not the Hollywood version, the real version. Messy, complicated, controversial, but ultimately, undeniably right. Louis Kurds shot his friends to save them, and because of that, 13 people lived. 13 families stayed intact, and 1 love story began in the most improbable way imaginable. The man who shot down the woman he loved before he even knew he loved her. The pilot who broke every rule and became a legend. The fighter ace whose most important victory wasn't against an enemy, it was for his friends. That's Louis Edward Kurds, and his story deserves to be remembered, not just as an oddity, but as proof that sometimes the most heroic act is the one that seems most wrong, and that real courage means being willing to be misunderstood, court-martialed, or executed to do what's right. He fired his guns at an American aircraft and saved everyone aboard, including his future wife. That's not just an amazing story. It's the definition of heroism. Unconventional, controversial, and absolutely true. But there is more to understand about this extraordinary moment. More about what it meant for a fighter pilot to make that decision. More about the context of the war in the Pacific in February 1945. And more about what happened after that day, both to Louis Kurds and to the 13 people he saved. The Pacific War in early 1945 was entering its final, most brutal phase. The Philippines were being liberated island by island, but Japanese resistance was fanatical. Unlike in Europe, where German soldiers would often surrender when the situation was hopeless, Japanese forces fought to the last man. They had been indoctrinated to believe that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, that death was preferable to capture, and that taking Americans with them was the highest form of service to the emperor. This mentality made the Pacific theater particularly dangerous for American pilots. If you were shot down and captured, you weren't sent to a prisoner of war camp where the Geneva Conventions might offer some protection. You were tortured for information, then executed, sometimes quickly, often slowly. The Japanese military viewed captured pilots as war criminals rather than prisoners of war. Because bombing campaigns targeted civilian areas, the Japanese argued that Allied pilots were murderers, not soldiers. Louis Kurds knew this. Every American pilot in the Pacific knew this. They had heard the stories, seen the intelligence reports, knew what happened to downed airmen who fell into Japanese hands. So when Kurds saw that C-47 heading toward a Japanese airfield, he wasn't just seeing an aircraft about to land in the wrong place. He was seeing 13 people about to enter a nightmare from which they would never escape. The decision to shoot wasn't easy. It wasn't instinctive. Kurds was a by-the-book pilot in most situations. He followed orders, respected chain of command, understood that military discipline existed for good reasons. But he also understood something deeper, that rules are tools to accomplish missions, not obstacles to overcome. And when rules prevent you from saving lives, you have to decide which is more important, the rule or the life. In those moments, circling above the C-47, Kurds ran through every possible option. Could he somehow fly in front of the transport and force it to change course? No, the C-47 would just fly around him. Could he somehow physically block its approach to the airfield? Impossible. One fighter couldn't stop a transport determined to land. Could he somehow communicate the danger through visual signals? He tried. The C-47 crew didn't understand or didn't see him, which left only one option: disable the aircraft, force it down, accept the consequences. The mechanics of what Kurds did are worth examining. Shooting down an aircraft is not like shooting a target on the ground. Aircraft move in 3 dimensions. They're fast, they're maneuverable, and you're moving too, often at several hundred miles per hour. Hitting a specific part of an aircraft, like a single engine, requires exceptional marksmanship and an understanding of ballistics, lead angles, and deflection shooting that most people can't comprehend. Kurds was a master at it. His 12 confirmed kills weren't luck, they were skill. He understood how to calculate where a target would be when his bullets arrived, how to compensate for wind, altitude, and relative motion, how to fire in short, precise bursts that conserved ammunition and maintained accuracy. All of that training, all of that experience came together in those moments when he targeted the C-47's engines. He didn't spray bullets wildly. He didn't fire long bursts that might have hit the fuselage and killed passengers. He aimed with surgical precision at the engine cowlings, fired controlled bursts, hit exactly what he was aiming for, and, crucially, he stopped shooting the moment the engines were disabled. He could have destroyed the entire aircraft, turned it into flaming wreckage falling from the sky, but he didn't, because his goal wasn't destruction, it was salvation. The pilot of that C-47, Captain John Summers, later described what the experience was like from inside the aircraft. "We were flying along, confident we were on the right heading. The navigation had been tricky because of weather and radio issues, but we thought we knew where we were. Then, suddenly, the right engine exploded. Just exploded. We had no idea what happened. We thought maybe it was catastrophic mechanical failure. We were trying to control the aircraft when the left engine got hit too. Then we saw the P-51, and we realized someone was shooting at us. An American fighter was shooting at us. We couldn't understand why. The pilot, I think his name was Summers, was screaming on the radio asking what was happening. And then we heard this calm voice, "You're heading toward enemy territory. Ditch in the ocean." And suddenly it all made sense. We were lost. We were about to land at a Japanese airfield, and this fighter pilot had just saved our lives by shooting us down. Captain Summers' recollection, recorded in a debriefing report now housed in the National Archives, confirms every detail of Curtis' account. The C-47 had suffered multiple navigation equipment failures. Their gyro compass was malfunctioning. Their radio compass was giving erratic readings, and in trying to navigate by dead reckoning and visual landmarks, they had become completely disoriented. They thought they were heading to an American-controlled airfield near Manila. In reality, they were heading to a former American airfield near Bataan that had been captured by Japanese forces weeks earlier. The 13 people aboard that C-47 included the 3-man flight crew and 10 Army nurses. The nurses were part of the 803rd Medical Air Evacuation Squadron, being transferred from Guam to Manila to staff a field hospital supporting the Philippine Liberation Campaign. Among them was Second Lieutenant Velma Mayers from Sacramento, California. She had been an Army nurse for 2 years, had served in the Pacific Theater for 18 months, had seen more death and suffering than any 24-year-old should ever see. And on February 10, 1945, she came within minutes of becoming a Japanese prisoner of war. What would have happened if the C-47 had landed at that Japanese airfield is not speculation. Historical records document what happened to American personnel, especially women, captured in the Philippines. The treatment was uniformly brutal. American nurses captured when the Philippines fell in 1942 were held in internment camps under horrific conditions. They were starved, forced to work as slave labor, subject to random beatings and abuse. And as the war turned against Japan and liberation approached, many prisoners were executed rather than released. The Palawan Massacre of December 1944, just 2 months before Curtis' intervention, demonstrated Japanese intentions toward American prisoners. When American forces approached Palawan Island, Japanese guards herded 150 American prisoners of war into air raid shelters, poured gasoline on them, and burned them alive. Only 11 escaped. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was policy. As defeat became inevitable, Japanese commanders increasingly chose to execute prisoners rather than allow them to be liberated. The 10 nurses aboard that C-47 would have faced similar or worse treatment. Being women wouldn't have protected them. It would have made them targets for additional abuse. The intelligence reports that circulated among American commanders in early 1945 were clear. Do not allow female personnel to fall into Japanese hands. The consequences were too terrible to contemplate. Louis Kurtz prevented that fate. By shooting down that C-47, he guaranteed that those 10 nurses would not become victims of Japanese war crimes. He saved 3 flight crew members from execution, and he did it by committing an act that, in any other context, would have been court-martialed as friendly fire, negligence, or even attempted murder. The aftermath of the incident was complicated. The military bureaucracy didn't know how to process what had happened. There was no precedent, no regulation covering intentional destruction of friendly aircraft to save it. The Judge Advocate General's office reviewed the case. They interviewed everyone involved. They examined Kurt's service record, his combat experience, his previous actions, and they concluded that while his decision was irregular, it was justified by the circumstances and the outcome.
But not everyone agreed.
Some officers argued that Curtis should have simply escorted the C-47 and tried to signal it more persistently, that shooting it down was an overreaction, that he had endangered lives unnecessarily. The debate within the military hierarchy was intense, and it revealed deep divisions about the nature of command authority and independent action. In the end, what saved Curtis from punishment was the testimony of the people he saved. All 13 survivors wrote statements supporting his actions. Captain Summers was particularly forceful. Lieutenant Curtis saved 13 American lives. He did so with exceptional skill and judgment. His shooting was precise. He disabled our aircraft without killing anyone, and he immediately took action to ensure our rescue. If he hadn't shot us down, we would have landed at a Japanese airfield and been captured or killed. Every person aboard that C-47 owes their life to Lieutenant Curtis. He should be decorated, not punished. The nurses echoed this sentiment. Velma Mayers wrote in her statement, "I am alive today because Lieutenant Curtis had the courage to do something unprecedented. He broke the rules to save lives. That's what a hero does. I hope the Air Force recognizes his actions for what they were, the most selfless act of bravery I have witnessed in this war." These statements, compiled into an official report, made it impossible to punish Curtis. How could you court-martial someone when everyone he supposedly wronged was thanking him? The military instead took the politically convenient path. They classified his actions as justified under exceptional circumstances, recommended him for a commendation, and quietly advised all pilots that shooting down friendly aircraft remained forbidden, except in situations exactly like this one, which would probably never occur again. Curtis received the Distinguished Flying Cross for the incident. The citation read, "For extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight, Lieutenant Curtis, observing a friendly transport aircraft heading toward enemy-controlled territory and unable to establish radio contact, took decisive action to prevent the capture of friendly personnel by disabling the aircraft's engines, forcing an emergency water landing. His exceptional marksmanship resulted in the safe recovery of all 13 personnel aboard. His courage and quick thinking exemplify the highest traditions of military service." The citation was carefully worded. It never said he shot down the aircraft. It said he disabled it. It never mentioned that he destroyed American property. It emphasized that he saved lives. The military was threading a needle, recognizing heroism while not quite endorsing the method. But Louis Curtis didn't care about the politics. He cared that 13 people lived, and increasingly, he cared about one of those 13 people in particular, Velma Mayers. Their relationship developed quickly. In the compressed timeline of war, where tomorrow might never come, people formed connections at accelerated speed. Louis and Velma saw each other almost daily. He would visit the hospital. She would meet him at the officers' club. They talked about everything, their childhoods, their families, their dreams for after the war. They found in each other something that the war couldn't touch, a space of normalcy and hope in a world of violence and death. Velma told her friends, "He saved my life, but more than that, he showed me what kind of man he is. Someone who will break every rule to do what's right. Someone who risks everything to protect others. How can you not fall in love with someone like that?" Louis told his fellow pilots, "I shot down hundreds of planes in practice, 12 enemy fighters in combat, and then I shot down one friendly transport, and somehow that last one changed my life more than all the others combined, because she was on it." They got engaged 3 weeks after the incident. Some people thought it was too fast. Trauma bonding, Stockholm Syndrome in reverse. But those who knew them both saw something genuine, a connection that transcended the circumstances. They weren't just pilot and rescued passenger. They were two people who had found each other in the chaos of war and recognized that they had something worth fighting for beyond victory. The war continued. Lewis flew more missions. Velma treated more wounded. They wrote letters when separated, met whenever possible, planned a future that seemed impossible to imagine clearly while the war raged, but they held on to it, the dream of peace, of home, of a life together. Lewis' final 2 air-to-air victories came in March 1945 during missions over Luzon. Both were Japanese fighters attacking American ground positions. Both times, Kurds shot them down with the same precision he had shown with the C-47's engines. Quick bursts, minimal ammunition expenditure, maximum effect. His total stood at 14 confirmed kills when the war ended, but it was the C-47 kill that defined him. When other pilots asked about his combat record, he always mentioned it first. "I shot down 12 German and Japanese fighters, and I shot down 1 American transport to save it. That's the one I'm proudest of." He had the crew chief paint the American flag kill marking on Bad Angel. It was small, barely noticeable among the swastikas and rising suns, but Kurds knew it was there, and it meant more to him than all the enemy kills combined. Because enemy kills were his job. The C-47 was his choice, a choice to prioritize lives over regulations, a choice that could have destroyed his career, but instead defined his legacy. After the war, Lewis and Velma settled in California. He continued flying for the Air Force. She worked as a civilian nurse. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. They built a normal life, quiet, peaceful, the kind of life that soldiers dream about during war but can't quite believe will ever exist. But the story of how they met never faded. At parties, someone would always ask, "How did you two meet?" And Louis and Velma would exchange a look. Then one of them would say, "He shot me down," and people would laugh, thinking it was a joke. Then Velma would add, "No, really, he shot down the plane I was on, to save me. And I married him anyway." And then they would tell the story. And every time they told it, people were amazed. Because it wasn't just an incredible war story. It was proof that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is something that looks like the opposite. Louis destroyed Velma's plane, forced her into a crash landing in the ocean, put her through trauma and terror, and all of it was an act of love before he even knew her name. Their children grew up hearing the story. Their grandchildren heard it, and eventually historians heard it. The tale of the fighter pilot who shot down a friendly plane and married one of the people he saved became part of World War II lore. It appeared in books, in documentaries, in military history courses, as an example of decision-making under pressure, of courage that looks like madness, of love stories that began in the most improbable ways. Louis Kurds never regretted his decision. In interviews later in life, he was always clear, "I would do it again, without hesitation." 13 lives versus maybe a court-martial? That's not even a difficult choice. You save lives. You deal with consequences. That's what being a soldier means. Velma was equally clear. "My husband shot me out of the sky, and it was the greatest gift anyone ever gave me. Because if he hadn't, I wouldn't have survived the war. I wouldn't have married him, wouldn't have had my children, wouldn't have had this life. So yes, he shot me down, and I'll be grateful for that every day until I die." They were married for 49 years. Louis died in 1995. Velma survived him by 13 years, dying in 2008 at the age of 87. At her funeral, one of her daughters read from a letter Velma had written shortly before her death. "People always ask if I was angry when I learned that the fighter pilot who shot us down was the same man I had met the night before. I wasn't angry. I was amazed. Because what are the odds that the man who saved your life is the same man you'll fall in love with? It's like the universe conspired to bring us together. He shot me down so I would land in his life, and I wouldn't change a single thing. That's the real story of Louis Kurds and Velma Mares. Not just a tale of combat heroics, but a love story that began with bullets and ended with a lifetime of gratitude. A story that proves courage isn't about following orders. It's about making impossible choices and living with them. A story that shows love sometimes begins in the strangest ways, and that sometimes the person who disrupts your life is the person who saves it. Louis Edward Kurds shot down 14 enemy aircraft in World War II, but his most important victory was the one that wasn't an enemy. The friendly aircraft he destroyed to save it. The transport carrying the woman he would marry. The mission that defined him more than any other. The day he chose to risk everything to save 13 people he didn't know, including the one person who would become the center of his world. That's heroism. That's love. And that's why the story of Louis Kurds and the C-47 will never be forgotten. Because it reminds us that sometimes the most important thing you can do is something that seems completely wrong. That sometimes destruction is the only path to salvation. And that sometimes the worst day of someone's life is the beginning of their happiest chapter. He shot her down. She fell in love with him. And together, they proved that even in war, even in chaos, even in moments of impossible decisions, human connection finds a way. Love finds a way. And stories that seem too extraordinary to be true turn out to be the most true of all.
Louis Kurds, fighter ace, rule breaker, husband, hero,
The man who shot down the right plane for all the right reasons, and lived happily ever after with one of the people he saved. That's not just a great war story. That's proof that sometimes the universe has a sense of humor, and that the craziest decisions can lead to the best outcomes. 14 kills, 1 love story, a lifetime of gratitude, and 1 small American flag painted on a P-51 Mustang named Bad Angel. That's the legacy of Louis Kurds, the pilot who shot his friends to save them, and found love in the wreckage. Velma was equally clear. My husband shot me out of the sky, and it was the greatest gift anyone ever gave me, because if he hadn't, I wouldn't have survived the war. I wouldn't have married him, wouldn't have had my children, wouldn't have had this life. So, yes, he shot me down, and I'll be grateful for that every day until I die. They were married for 49 years. Louis died in 1995. Velma survived him by 13 years, dying in 2008 at the age of 87. At her funeral, one of her daughters read from a letter Velma had written shortly before her death. People always ask if I was angry when I learned that the fighter pilot who shot us down was the same man I had met the night before. I wasn't angry. I was amazed, because what are the odds that the man who saved your life is the same man you'll fall in love with? It's like the universe conspired to bring us together. He shot me down so I would land in his life, and I wouldn't change a single thing. Louis Kurds, fighter ace, rule breaker, husband, hero. The man who shot down the right plane for all the right reasons, and lived happily ever after with one of the people he saved. That's not just a great war story. That's proof that sometimes the universe has a sense of humor, and that the craziest decisions can lead to the best outcomes. 14 kills, 1 love story, a lifetime of gratitude, and 1 small American flag painted on a P-51 Mustang named Bad Angel. That's the legacy of Louis Kurds, the pilot who shot his friends to save them, and found love in the wreckage. Louis Kurds, fighter ace, rule breaker, husband, hero. The man who shot down the right plane for all the right reasons, and lived happily ever after with one of the people he saved. That's not just a great war story. That's proof that sometimes the universe has a sense of humor, and that the craziest decisions can lead to the best outcomes. 14 kills, one love story, a lifetime of gratitude, and one small American flag painted on a P-51 Mustang named Bad Angel. That's the legacy of Louis Kurds, the pilot who shot his friends to save them and found love in the wreckage.